Brian said, I'm John Cabrick. I'm with the Northern Research Station. I'm located at the University of Missouri campus here in Columbia, Missouri. And I want to talk a little bit about the ecology and management of oaks today. So what I want to talk about today and cover is I'm going to give you an overview of oak ecology and silvics and talk about things like shade tolerance and growth strategies and adaptations and traits of oaks. Then I want to move into regeneration dynamics, talk about flowering, fruiting, and acorn production, get into seedling establishment, early growth, and then talk about seedling recruitment. And at the end, I'll put those things together to talk a little bit about silvicultural practices and how that helps us understand how we can manage our oak forests to regenerate them and to tend them and grow them. So I put together a little list of all of the oaks that we have in Missouri, just to give you a sense of what they might be. I came up with a list of 18, so that's my big list. Maybe I've missed a few, maybe I have too many, I'm not really quite sure. The ones I have here in bold are upland oaks, and I'll focus mostly on upland oaks today. But there are many bottomland oaks as well. Just be aware of that. And some of them actually you can find in both bottomlands and uplands in certain circumstances. So I just wanted to give get you a little bit of information about all the oaks that we have in Missouri. We're very rich in oaks. We probably have some of the most number of oak species than most places do it in the United States. So we have quite a heritage of that here in Missouri. When it comes to oak ecology, I want to focus on things like shade tolerance, growth strategy and growth rates, adaptations and traits, site preferences, and tolerances. So I'll begin with shade tolerance and say that, well, in general, oaks are moderately tolerant of shade. So they do not need to have full sunlight in order to regenerate and grow, which is pretty good news for us, because that means that we have a lot of flexibility in how we can control light levels in the overstory to affect our seedlings and the growth of those seedlings on the forest floor. Now, I will say that shade tolerance decreases with age. So a lot of our seedlings are actually more tolerant of shade than the adult of the same species. So as the trees get older, they become a little less shade tolerant. Not all oaks have the shade tolerance, same shade tolerance. I wanted to give you a little perspective on that. So I have a little scale here on the bottom of the slide that shows on the left shade tolerance and on the right intolerance of shade. And if we look at our common upland oaks, we see that white oak here is on the left side, and it's one of our more shade tolerant oaks. And on the right side, we have post oak, which is one of our more intolerant oaks of shade tolerance. So post oaks require more light than do white oaks. Now, knowing that there's some differences in the shade tolerances of our individual species really helps us a lot with our regeneration planning and how we might go about practicing silviculture. So it's always good to know these kinds of things. I'll talk a little bit about growth strategy and growth rates. And in general, oaks have a very conservative growth strategy. What they want to do is produce large seeds, or acorns. They generally are trees that grow more slowly than a lot of other tree species. In the process of doing this, they're developing large, wide crowns. So they're putting a lot of energy into crown development. They're also putting a lot of their energy into developing a larger root system. And then another characteristic of our conservative growth strategy is that oaks in general have a moderate to long lifespan. They want to be in it for the long run. So they're adapted to a wide variety of conditions that enable them to stay in those stands for long periods of time. This causes a number of adaptations and traits to occur in oaks. So for example, oaks are very drought resistant. Those large root systems that they develop really help them to get through drought periods. In fact, oaks maintain a very high growth rate even during dry periods. And this actually helps them to grow faster than some other species that do not have this characteristic on really dry sites. Oaks are also very disturbance resistant, whether that disturbance be fire, which has the ability to top kill seedlings, but the top killed oaks, because of those large root systems that they have, will resprout readily and continue to grow in that stand. Also, many species of mature oaks have very thick bark, This helps them resist any sort of damage or mortality caused by fire that should occur in those stands. And white oaks and post oaks and some of the other white oak group species have this great ability to compartmentalize wounds. So they're able to seal off or wall off any kind of injury in the internal part of the tree that keeps them from rotting or decaying. So we tend to have a pretty good wood product, even if they are exposed to a little fire. Oaks are also very resistant to browsing. So just like top kill by fire, if a oak seedling is browsed, so it's bitten off, that seedling has the ability to resprout readily and to help populate that next stand because of those big root systems in those seedlings. And of course, I like to talk about site preferences in oaks, site preferences and tolerances. And most oak trees, like many other oaks or many other tree species, grow best in deep, well-drained soils of moderate pH. And really, what plant wouldn't want to grow in deep, well-drained soils with moderate pH? So the best growth is attained under those conditions, but oaks are very, very tolerant of droughty soils, shallow, rocky soils. They're very tolerant of nutrient deficient soils. So soils that have low nutrient supply, oaks are able to grow quite well, even if the nutrient concentrations are low in those soils. And so the oaks also have this ability to deal with soils that have a very low pH, they're very acidic, that have very high concentrations of aluminum in that soil solution. A lot of plants are very susceptible to aluminum toxicity. It's poisonous to the plant roots, but oaks seem to be able to tolerate that quite well and grow in soils that have high aluminum concentration. All right, I'm going to switch gears a little bit and start talking about regeneration dynamics. And I'm going to include everything from flowering, fruiting, and production and dispersal of acorns themselves, the seedlings that become established in the early growth from the germinating acorns, and then also talk a little bit about seedling recruitment. So taking small oak trees and growing them into larger size classes. That's the definition of recruitment. So when to begin with flowering, fruiting, and acorn production and dispersal, it's important to recognize that oaks have both male flowers on catkins and female flowers, each on the same tree. So this means that all oak trees are capable of producing acorns. This is important to know because there are some tree species that only have female plant flowers or only have male plant flowers on them, but oaks have both. Flowering and acorn production with oaks usually begins anywhere from about age 15 to 25 years old. So this means by about that age, they're able to flower and produce acorns and have acorns available to drop on the ground. Our white oak group species complete the reproduction cycle from flowering to acorn production in a single growing season. And red oak group species require 2 growing seasons to complete the reproduction cycle. So what happens during the first year is a red oak group species might flower, and those flowers are pollinated, and they may begin to produce the bud that will begin to produce the acorn, and that will appear on the branch. And then in the following year, in the following growing season, that bud will become a full-size acorn and drop on the ground. And the importance of knowing that is that a lot of foresters and a lot of wildlife biologists in particular like to see a mixture of oak species in their stands, of both white oak group species and red oak group species. Because of this 2-year cycle for the red oak group species and the 1-year cycle of the white oak group species, we're almost assured we're going to have some sort of acorn crop in any given year. So for example, if we have a late spring frost that kills some of the flowers on both the red oaks and the white oaks, at the end of that year, our white oak group species will probably not produce any acorns at all. But since the red oak group species, the flowers were pollinated in the previous year, we're likely to have some acorns that are produced from the red oak group species that year. So you can see by having these 2 different groups present in your stands, we're somewhat assured of having some sort of acorn crop. Now, I will say there is very high year-to-year variability in acorn production with our oaks. And so you'll hear things like 1 year in 4 is a good mast year, 1 year in 5, or 1 year in 7. So there's just a lot of variation. This variation is due to all the different factors that are all working together to allow acorns to be produced at the end of the year, including things like weather patterns. So if we have late frosts in the springtime, or if we have summer drought, these can actually reduce acorn production. If we have warm spring temperatures and good adequate soil moisture all summer long, we might have a really good bumper crop of acorns. Insect damage to either oak flowers or oak leaves can have an effect on acorn production. So any kind of predation going on the plant itself will affect the success of acorn production. Now, within acorns themselves, there's a high level of acorn damage predation that takes place. We have insect damage by curculio weevils, filbert worm moths, gall wasps, and so forth. Some are laying eggs in these, are leaving larvae in these acorns, and they're affecting their ability to germinate. And of course, acorns are food for deer, turkeys, and squirrels and other small animals. So a lot of acorns are eaten during the year. A couple of facts to know about acorn production in trees, and these are all things that we have some ability to affect as managers. In general, large oaks will produce more acorns than small oak trees. So tree size matters, and it's going to have an impact on your acorn production. Open grown oaks will produce more acorns than forest grown oaks. We know that when oak trees are grown in the open, they develop the widest crowns possible, and we have more crown volume and crown area for producing acorns. And one thing to keep in mind is some individual oak trees are better acorn producers than others. So that if you are familiar with the trees in your stand, you can then learn about which oaks are year to year are good producers of acorns. And you know that you can then do some thinning around those oak trees to allow those crowns to expand to produce even more acorns. So these are all things that we have some ability to affect as managers in our team. So I'm going to talk a little bit more now about seedling establishment and early growth. I have some pictures here on the slide that I took just about 2 weeks ago when I was working on my tree farm here just north of Columbia in Boone County. And one of the things I see, I found, and I show in this picture here in the upper right, is I had a carpet of white oak seedlings occur across my tree farm. And we had a bumper crop of white oak acorns last year on my property. In fact, it was, if you walked around in the forest out there, it was like walking on marbles. And I have a really nice crop of white oak seedlings. And what I want to show you, though, these 1-year-old seedlings are not very large. So I have a glove here for scale, and I pulled one of those seedlings out and laid it across the hood of my tractor. And you can see that we have like a little 4-inch stem of white oak here, about 4 inches tall above ground. And here's the root collar here. And you can see there's about 4 or 5 inches of root coming down this way. But notice how thick that root is. That's a really large root. So one of the things that the oaks do is they really build root system right away. So white oak acorns germinate after falling on the ground. So in the fall, those acorns come down and they start to germinate immediately. Our red oak group acorns require a cold period. So they go through a process called stratification. Winter cool temperatures allow that stratification to take place, and red oak group species will actually germinate in the following spring. Early shoot growth is very, very slow, and it's very slow due to the development of those root systems like I'm showing here in the pictures. Because this growth is slow, the new oak seedlings really do not compete well with other tree species. If we were to do a harvest at this point on my tree farm and try to release these oak acorns, or oak seedlings, there's a very low probability that any of these seedlings would reach maturity because of their size is so small. They need time to develop the root system in order to be competitive. So oaks rely on something called advanced reproduction. And advanced reproduction includes seedlings or seedling sprouts, which are seedlings that have died back and resprouted, and even potential stub sprouts, small diameter stems that if we cut off will resprout. We need these to develop in the understory in advance of a final harvest, and that's why it's called advanced reproduction. So advanced reproduction in our oak stands will accumulate over long periods of time underneath mature oak forests and woodlands, as long as there's sufficient light to support those seedlings. So understanding that oak advanced reproduction is really critical for regenerating the stand is an important concept. I have some slides that show the sources of advanced reproduction a little more closely. We can talk about true seedlings, which are recent germinates. They might have 1 or 2 flushes, and these are the small seedlings that you see from an acorn shortly after it germinates. I say multiple flushes because even during the first growing season, there might be 2 growth flushes, and you can see a little branch scar that develops in between them, and you can actually count the flushes on the stem. Seedling sprouts are older seedlings that have developed a larger root system and a larger stem diameter. They may have 2 or many flushes that you can observe on those stems. And these are going to be seedlings that are anywhere from 6 inches to maybe 3 feet tall. So they've been around for a while. They've been growing in the understory of that forest. There's enough light to support them, and they're building large root systems as they're hanging around in the understory of that forest. And then, of course, stump sprouts, which originate from stems that are either cut or somehow damaged, say like during a harvest operation. And if they're small diameter, they will produce a pretty good sprout that will help contribute to the next forest in that stand. So when it comes to seedling recruitment, this deals with the ability to accumulate large oak advanced reproduction, and it's strongly affected by site quality. So if oaks tend to be much more competitive on our stands where our soil pH is less than 5.5, or where our soil water holding capacity of that soil is either low to moderate, or on slopes and slope aspects, either on ridges or south-facing slopes that tend to be a little bit drier, and where our site productivity, which we use the site index to tell us, where our site index is less than 55 feet. And for those of you who may not be familiar, the site index is the expected tree height at age 50. And we have some graphs and figures that we can use to calculate that. And so if we have all of these conditions met, we'll probably have some ability to naturally accumulate oak advanced reproduction. On high quality sites, one of the problems that we have, so high quality sites would be those that have a higher pH than 5.5 or a high water holding capacity, or perhaps they're on north facing slopes and lower slope positions with a site index greater than 55. They support a number of different tree species and shrub species that potentially shade oak seedlings, and that prevents them from either accumulating on the forest floor or reduces their number, their size, or their survival. And so that's how site quality interacts. In fact, we have some terminology that we use to describe this. We can refer to sites as being intrinsic oak accumulators, which are sites that have a propensity to accumulate oak advanced reproduction readily over long periods of time. And these are typically our dry, nutrient-poor sites with a site index of less than 55 feet. It might include soils like Keswick, Gorin, Hatton, Bardley, Clinkenbeard, Marion. These would occur on ridges and upper slopes. Maybe you're familiar with some of these soils. Maybe these are soils that you might have on your property. And the reason why these are intrinsic oak accumulators is because we generally have fewer oak competitors in the mid and understory shading out the oak seedlings. We have some sites we refer to as recalcitrant oak accumulators. These are sites that cannot retain oak advanced reproduction. These typically are mesic and nutrient rich, so high water supply, high nutrient supply. Site index values might be 75 feet or higher. The soils might include series like Menfro, Winfield, Rocheport, Winnigan, Lindley, Haymond. There are several that I could list. They generally occur on north and east facing slopes, on terraces, or even bottomlands. So these are very rich sites. And their problem, the reason why oaks have a tendency not to accumulate, is because we have many competitors in the mid and understory that shade out those oak seedlings. And then we have the sites we call ambivalent oak accumulators. These are sites that are sort of in between the categories, but with our silvicultural disturbances, they're very amenable to be manipulated a little bit to accumulate oak advanced reproduction. And these are the ones that are sort of in between in terms of their moisture and nutrient supply and site index. So some tenets of oak reproduction. The oak component after the final overstory removal depends on the size, number, and distribution of oak advanced reproduction. And the reliance on oak advanced reproduction does vary a little bit by species. And I'll show you a figure that kind of illustrates that. And on this figure, the y-axis shows the dependence on oak seedlings for reproduction. And on the x-axis, we have the relative dependence on oak sprouting. So the ability of either stump sprouts or seedling sprouts or large advanced reproduction to fill that void. And you can see with species like black oak and post oak, our drier site species, they tend to rely more on sprouting. And in our more mesic sites, like in bottomlands and lower north-facing slopes, a lot of our species there have a little greater tendency to rely on producing seedlings from germinates and acorns being recruited. So there is a little bit of variation in that. But as a general rule, the more advanced reproduction that we have, the larger it is, the easier it is for us to regenerate oaks. So the final tenet of oak regeneration is once advanced reproduction is established, oaks can be recruited in a number of different ways. And so that brings me to talking about silvicultural practices. And this is a slide that Dr. Stelzer showed last week in the webinar, if you were able to tune into that. And I wanted to pick up from there and talk about some of these different silvicultural practices, including regeneration practices, establishment practices, and tending practices. And I'm going to begin in the middle of this figure with establishment practices. So let's talk about establishment practices for oaks. And notice in here I say establishment and or early release practices, because a lot of these different practices that I'm going to describe not only help establish oak seedlings, but they also help small oak seedlings that you have on the forest floor to become larger and much more competitive and able to provide adequate regeneration for a future forest. The first one I want to talk about is mid-story removal. And this is where we remove trees below the upper canopy. So the mid-story trees and some of the understory trees. And what this has the effect of is it increases the light levels on the ground to about a level of about 15 to 20% of full sunlight. And this may not sound like a lot, but this allows oak seedlings and saplings that are already present in the stand to continue to grow and to build those root systems. And it does so in a way without releasing a lot of competitors. So now we're building our roots, we're allowing our oaks to become bigger and much more competitive in size. And if we should, at some point down the road, do a regeneration harvest, now those oak seedlings could be quite competitive. Another establishment or early release practice that we can use is prescribed fire. Prescribed fire has a very similar effect on mid-story removal because it removes trees below the upper canopy. And because oaks have these large root systems, any top-killed oak seedling will resprout readily and continue to survive and grow in that stand. And over time, periodic prescribed fire will improve oak seedling establishment and also the competitive stature, their size of those oak seedlings in the understory. Prescribed fire is also essential to woodland management, and we're going to hear more about that in the next presentation following mine. Once oaks are established in the understory, fire would be withheld for some period of time during the regeneration process. So when we're ready to regenerate that stand, and we've been practicing the prescribed fire for a period of years, we might want to stop that practice for maybe 10 to 30 years during the regeneration process to allow those oak seedlings to grow into the story. If you find that you do not have enough oak advanced reproduction on your site, we can remedy that a little bit. One thing that we can do is do some planting. So where oak advanced reproduction abundance is considered to be inadequate, we don't have enough, oak seedlings can also be planted. The best results with planting occur when it's done in conjunction with a mid-story removal. So if we're starting to remove some of those mid-story trees, we can plant some seedlings in that understory, And there we're going to be giving those planted trees enough light to build those root systems and to become larger. At some point, we can have prescribed fire back in that stand, but we want to make sure that those seedlings get established firmly and have a couple of years to build root system before we would reintroduce a prescribed fire. One other practice that we can do to help with increasing the amount of oak seedlings on the forest floor is a scarification practice using some sort of mechanical rake to scrape the soil. This is typically done in the autumn after we've had a good acorn drop. In fact, it's best to do this to time it so that if you know that you have a good bumper crop of acorns coming on, this might be the time to get ready to do the scarification. So what we do is we allow those acorns to drop, and then we can get out and do that raking. And what this does, that raking and scarifying, what it does is it increases the acorn contact with the mineral soil. And the reason why that's important is because it's going to protect the acorns from drying out. Acorns have to maintain a pretty high moisture level in order to remain viable and be able to germinate. The second thing is having contact with the soil or having those acorns actually in the mineral soil protects them from predation. So in general, scarification usually leads to higher seedling counts in the following year than if we don't do the scarification practice. Which brings me to talking about some of our regeneration practices. The first practice I wanted to talk about is clear cutting. And with clear cutting, you can see in these pictures here on the left, we're going to remove most, if not all, of the trees at once. And I just wanted to bring to your attention, when we do a clear cut, we have reserve trees that can be left in the stand. Reserve trees are usually left to benefit wildlife or to ensure that we have biodiversity or for other reasons other than regenerating the stand, but they can be left behind as part of that practice. And the thing to know about clear cutting, as you can see this in the lower left figure, is that very quickly produces a rank regrowth of trees. And so shortly within a year or so after doing a clear cut, pretty soon that stand is going to become very thick with woody vegetation. In fact, it's so thick and it changes so quickly that if we don't have lots of large oak seedlings in that stand prior to doing the clear cut, we may lose that stand to other species that might be growing faster than do oaks. So we need to make sure that we have a presence of large advanced reproduction prior to doing a clear cut. This method works pretty well for regenerating oaks on dry sites or places where we have acid soils, largely because we have fewer oak competitors, and that allows those oak seedlings to become large before we do that clear cut. A more common way that we generate oaks these days is through a practice called the shelter wood. And what a shelter wood does is we're going to remove the existing forest, but we're going to do so in a series of harvests. There might be 2, there might be 3, there might be 4 times that we revisit that forest through that harvest practice. And there's a picture here on the right that shows what a shelter wood looks like maybe after we've done the first entry. Notice that we leave a lot of the canopy dominance, the future timber trees of that stand, and we removed some of the smaller trees in the understory to really favor the establishment and growth of oaks in that understory. So the remaining large trees are left to modify the environment underneath. They create shelter for that next generation of forest. And these small increases in light will improve the growth of oak seedlings without releasing all the competitors. So now we're allowing those oak seedlings to become a little bit larger, and we're not just letting all these other competitors loose to start to outgrow some of these oaks and shade them out. The remaining trees can be fully or partially harvested when the oak seedlings have become large. So once we've determined that we have sufficient numbers of large advanced reproduction, we can go in there and remove more of those trees. And I think I'll describe is that this method is very adaptable to a variety of site conditions and oak seedling sizes that you may have in your stand. So I'll talk a little bit about shelterwood flexibility and show us how we can use these shelterwoods in various ways to help grow competitive oak seedlings and then release them eventually through a final harvest. And to do that, I'm going to refer to our new oaks, which are less than 6 inches tall. These are our recent germinates. They tend to have a basal diameter or a stem diameter of about 1/4 of an inch. So they're very, very small. And if we have a high number of new oaks in our stand and not many larger ones, what we might do with our shelter wood is do something that resembles a mid-story removal, where we take out about 20 to 30% of the stand, thinning from the smallest diameters up to the larger, and pretty much just removing the mid and understory. And when we do that, that's where we can allow those new oak seedlings to then grow bigger root systems and to become taller and to become what we call the established oaks in the established oak size class. Established oaks are between 6 inches and 3 feet tall. They generally have a basal diameter from about 1/4 to 3/4 of an inch. And these are the very much more competitive oaks in this size class. And if we have an abundance of established size oaks in our stand, the shelter wood that we might do, we cut a little bit harder. We might remove about 40 to 70% of that overstory. And what that does is allows those established oaks to grow well in that understory there. And they can grow to become larger faster under that greater removal of the overstory. If we find that in our forest that we have competitive oak seedlings, and competitive oak seedlings are those that are greater than 3 feet tall, and they have basal diameters of 3/4 of an inch or larger, we can cut that stand a lot harder in our initial entry and allow that oak cohort in the understory to grow up into the overstory pretty quickly. So that's kind of how that looks and how we can come back in and do a series of cuttings depending on what sizes of oak seedlings that we're beginning with. So with shelter wood, there's a lot of flexibility. The focus is on developing established oaks or larger oaks in that understory before we release them. The established oaks compete well on sites of low and medium site quality. Sometimes on high site qualities, we still may have to go in and do some follow-up work, and I'll describe that in a minute. The shelter wood treatment usually leaves a residual stocking of about 30 to 60%, which is enough light to maximize oak growth, but while not completely releasing all oak competitors. We have opportunities in that shelter wood to treat our competitors, to cut the stems down, to apply some herbicide. We can do some other things to try to reduce the sprouting of some of those competing species. When we do some of our establishment cuts in shelter woods, we want to come back in 5 or 10 years and reevaluate our reproduction. We want to see if we are building enough of that established oak or competitive oak. We want to know if it's ready to release it. Pending that evaluation, competitors, again, can be treated. We can either do some mechanical work, we can cut them down, we can apply some herbicides on the stumps if we need to. We can even come in at that point and use prescribed fire to release our oaks at that stage of the shelter. So I think you can see it's a pretty flexible method and gives us multiple opportunities to tend our oak seedlings and to treat competitors if they occur. I'm going to talk about group selection now. And group selection, like the name implies, we're going to remove groups of trees to create small openings. And these openings are generally about 1 to 2 tree heights in diameter. That's an approximation. They don't have to be perfectly round. But it does create openings in our forest that are about 1/10 to 1/2 acre in size. And that depends on the slope aspect. If we're on a south-facing slopes, a 1/10 acre or a 1 tree height removal is sufficient. When we get on north-facing slopes where there's a little bit less sunlight available, we might make a little larger opening. So our openings may be like two tree heights in that situation. And the idea is that we're trying to provide about 33% full sunlight inside of our group openings. And this is more than enough light for most of our oak species to grow quite well. So that's sort of what's key about a group selection, is that we're letting in sort of a moderate level of light to allow that regeneration. And on the outside, from the appearance, group openings seem to resemble small clear cuts. But it's important to realize that they are not exactly clear cuts, because group openings have less sunlight in the middle than, say, a clear cut would. Clear cuts, we're going to have full sunlight in the middle of them. That's by definition. So we're creating an environment of moderate light availability. With the group selection method, you also have some flexibility. You can take advantage of pockets of established or competitive oak advanced reproduction if it's present in your stand. So you can do little surveys and see where that competitive oak advanced reproduction exists. And if not, you have some opportunities before you do a group selection to try to get that oak advanced reproduction to a larger size class. We also have the ability to harvest merchantable trees in those groups. Perhaps they're for firewood harvest, perhaps they're at the commercial timber harvest. But you can also do that in the groups as part of that regeneration process. It produces growth or regrowth at a more manageable pace, providing opportunities to release oaks. Again, much like using the shelterwood method, the partial light conditions that we create in group selection kind of slows down some of that competition practice. It gives us more opportunities to get back in that stand and to work with some of our oaks to help ensure that they're going to grow into the overstory. There's also a lot of other benefits of group selection, including it produces nice openings for wildlife. And I will say they're very well suited for small woodlots where occasional cuts are acceptable and desired. I practice group selection on my own tree farm because of the flexibility it provides. Plus, it gives me the ability to keep a mostly forested condition on my small 40 acres of timber, but still allows for reproduction to take place. And it's working pretty well for me for oaks. One final practice I want to talk about with regeneration is single tree selection. This is where we're removing individual trees to provide space for the new ones. I will say about this method is that tends to favor shade tolerant tree species much more so than oaks. Those trees species that are more tolerant, like some of our maples, our dogwoods, ironwood species like that, they tend to grow much better under those light conditions than do oaks. I will say that on dry and nutrient deficient sites where oaks are favored, young oaks can regenerate under single tree selection, but they do develop very slowly. In fact, you're probably better off by creating slightly larger areas, not with single trees, but with small groups of trees to provide enough light for those trees to recruit. And then finally, I wanted to talk a little bit about tending practices. So once you already have a forest established, you've been through the regeneration process, at some point, we might want to think about doing some tending processes. These are applied to enhance the growth of existing stands. And two that I'm going to talk about, two general categories I'll talk about are crop tree release and area wide thinning. Crop tree release tends to be focused on releasing a small number of individual trees from competition. And it's more often done in sapling stands, although it can be done in older stands as well. Area wide thinning typically is for freeing desirable trees to enhance their growth. So we're trying to benefit all the trees in the stand that we're leaving behind. Crop tree release is usually applied to sapling stands, and really in sapling age stands, it's used to help ensure that desirable species are going to be retained and free to grow in the future. I have a diagram here on the right that illustrates how this might look in a stand or how you might apply crop tree release. And we're looking down at a top view of a stand of trees, and this tree here shown in green in the middle of each of these four figures is the crop tree that we've selected. Notice that we can divide that crop tree into four sides for simplicity of the application of the method. And we can release either one side, or we can release two sides, we can release three sides, or all four sides of that tree. And that's sort of how a crop tree release would look. In young stands, overtopped oaks can be released from competitors with this method. So if your stand is, say, in the 10 to 20-year-old range, and we have some oak trees that are getting overtopped, you have the ability to get in there and release those to try to ensure that you'll have oaks in that stand in the future. Now, with crop tree release, the goal is to release a small number of trees that we plan to carry to maturity. So we're not going to go through the entire stand and select hundreds of different trees to release. We're going to be very focused. We're going to try to focus on, say, 50 to 100 oaks per acre or so. And we want to do so on a spacing, say, maybe every 20 to 30 feet across that stand. So the idea is that we want to make sure that we're just focusing our energy on those trees that we know that we want to have around at by the time that stand becomes mature at the end of the year. So that's sort of how that might look. With area-wide thinning, we're usually applying this in stands that might be a little bit older, a little bit larger. So with trees that might range from 5 to 10 inches in diameter. And in this situation, the species composition may be set at that point. So we probably don't have a lot of opportunity to, let's say, release oaks at that point. They're probably going to be in the stand at that point, or some of them have already lost out to competitors. But the goal is to reduce the overall stand density by removing the poorer quality trees and release those that are more desirable based on species and form. And I have a little diagram here on the lower right that shows us, it's called a stocking diagram. Foresters use this pretty routinely to decide what density levels to apply to stands for different practices. And when we're thinning stands, we might be up here at a high density, close to this A line. And this red line shows that we might thin the stand. The average diameter might go up a little bit if we thin from below. And we want to bring it down to close to that B level. And this zone is called full occupancy. And then that stand will then respond by growing. Those individual trees we leave behind will respond by growing larger in diameter. So our average diameter goes up and our stocking goes back up towards that A level. And when we apply this in oak stands, our released oaks are expected to grow faster in diameter. So they're going to become saw timber size trees much faster. In the process, they're also going to start developing larger crowns by giving them more growing space in that thinning. And if we give them larger crowns, give them more growing space, they're also expected to produce more acorns. So there's a number of positive effects of thinning that we can see in our forests. One other tending practice I'm going to touch on is thinning and prescribed burning used in combination. This burning can be used for managing many of the other plants that we have in the forest along with our oaks. So this practice is used routinely in woodland management, but it favors a lot of the ground forest species that we have naturally in our oak woodlands and helps them as well as helping the oaks to establish and become larger in our stands as well. So I've talked about a lot of different things. It's a lot of information that I provided. So one of the things I would encourage you to do is to contact your local forester. Find someone who can help you explain some of this information. If this seems a little overwhelming, there's a lot of information I provided that a practicing forester can really help you understand how to apply some of these methods and techniques and manage your forest. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions that may have arisen in the chat. And I have my contact information that I want to make available. So feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions.